Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final lecture of the Distinguished Visiting Professor Online Series. I'm Professor Chui Kwok Tong, Acting Dean of Faculty of Education and Human Development. Today, I have the pleasure to present to you Professor Joanne Hill's lecture, Promoting Social Cohesion Through Shared Education in a Post-Conflict Society, a case study from Northern Ireland. Professor Joanne Hills is the Director of the Center for Shared Education, as well as Director of Research in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University, Belfast. She has distinguished herself in the research of the role of education in divided societies and inequalities in education. She has led more than 20 research projects and published widely on these themes. In 2016, she was appointed the UNESCO Chair for Globalizing a Shared Education Model for Improving Intergroup Relations in Divided Societies. She has advised government officials and ministers nationally and internationally on policies to promote good relations in schools. In this lecture, she will talk about the effectiveness of shared education in Northern Ireland as a unique approach to promote social cohesion in a deeply divided society. She will also examine the impact of shared education and the challenges that remain. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Joanne Hills.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here, though obviously I would prefer to be there. In my lecture today, I will talk about shared education in Northern Ireland as an approach to promoting social cohesion in a society that is transitioning from conflict, but that remains deeply divided. I'll outline the development of shared education as a unique approach against a backdrop of previous initiatives that have had varying degrees of effectiveness in respect of social cohesion. Drawing on theoretical literature, I will examine some of the evidence for the impact of shared education and the challenges that remain. So firstly, I want to say a little bit about the background to the conflict in Northern Ireland. As many of you will know, there have been tensions between Ireland and Britain for many centuries that led to the establishment of the state of Northern Ireland in 1921, a century ago. That state comprised two communities that had rival political and constitutional aspirations. The Catholic community, which generally desires unity with the Republic of Ireland, and the Protestant community, which generally desires maintenance of the status quo, in other words, that Northern Ireland remain part of the United Kingdom. Relating to these divergent political positions and fueled by historical events, a violent conflict then broke out in 1969 involving factions from each of the two communities and state forces. The violence led to the death of more than 3,500 people and injury of tens of thousands of others. A peace agreement was reached in 1998, ostensibly through a multi-party talks process, but also, it has to be said, underpinned by efforts on the part of the British government to resolve many of the grievances of the Catholic community pertaining to disadvantage and discrimination. Although the ceasefires or the agreement resulted in ceasefires and the demilitarization of Northern Ireland, significant divisions remain and many areas of life remain segregated. As this slide shows, a map of Northern Ireland, and that gives some sense of some of the patterns of residential segregation. The dark green areas on the map are areas that are almost exclusively Catholic, 90 to 100% Catholic. And the dark orange areas are areas that are almost exclusively Protestant. The big blue blob in the middle doesn't represent some alternative ethnic group, it's actually Lough Neagh. Pale orange and paler green areas are areas that are more mixed, but it should be noted that the most marginalised and economically deprived communities tend to be those that are also most segregated, with middle class and more affluent areas being more mixed. And you can also see that in the west of the province, you have a more nationalist population, and in the east of the province, a more unionist or Protestant population. This slide shows one of the physical manifestations of separation between the two communities. It's a dividing wall or a separation wall that's intended to reduce conflict between Catholic and Protestant areas that are side by side. Also notable is the fact that since the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement or Peace Agreement in 1998, more of these walls have actually been erected, and this slide shows you a new peace wall in Belfast. Other representations of community identity and territorial marking that are somewhat unique to Northern Ireland are these murals and flag flying. They appear mostly in working class communities, and they denote the struggle of one community over the other to either defend its position in the case of the Protestant community, or to meet its constitutional aspiration for a united Ireland in the case of the Catholic community. This slide is a compilation of images taken from Protestant areas. And you can notice in it references to the Union flag, to Britishness, to paramilitarism, and this slide then is from the murals from Catholic community, and you'll immediately notice the difference in the colour palette. So the references here are to the flag of the Republic of Ireland, the tricolour. It should also be said that even where visible representations of community identity are not apparent, as is the case in more middle class communities, everybody in Northern Ireland will have mental maps that demarcate areas, villages, schools, sporting institutions, churches, cultural traditions, as associated more with one community or the other, and often these associations will be negative or hostile. On the theme of segregation, one of the defining features of our divided society is a divided education system. And this slide shows you that most schools in Northern Ireland are predominantly one religion or the other. So around 94% of pupils since the establishment of the state have attended schools that are predominantly either Catholic or Protestant. And this means that, taken together with residential segregation, that young people have very limited or indeed no opportunity to meet others from a different ethnic or religious tradition than their own. The largely parallel education system has been contentious, particularly since the outbreak of conflict in the 1960s, with some commentators citing separate schooling as a contributor to intercommunal division and hostilities. Research evidence lends some support to this argument or position, with some studies reporting minimal cross-denominational engagement between staff and students of separate schools, limited or erroneous knowledge of the other group's religion, culture, and identity, and expressions of suspicion or fear towards peers from the other group. So in other words, the kind of physical separation is seen to contribute towards stereotyping and prejudice. maintenance and reproduction. Aside from the problems of physical separation, some research also points to the biased delivery of the curriculum. All schools in Northern Ireland have a common national curriculum, but teachers, like pupils, are products of a divided society. Many of them will have attended separate schools, and many of them will have attended separate teacher training colleges. So in this sense, they bring an interpretive lens to the classroom and to the teaching of subjects like history or religious education, or indeed other subjects, that's likely to reflect a particular community narrative. And some research has also shown that in terms of the hidden curriculum, this also endorses or perpetuates community positions and perspectives. So over the years, since the late 1970s, there have been various efforts to promote better relations through schools, and I've listed some of them here. Short-term contact initiatives were introduced in the late 1970s, and they sought to bring groups of Catholic and Protestant children together for encounter. Often these initiatives were, the problem with them was that they tended to be short-term, they tended to be one-off, they tended to be piecemeal, and teachers adopted a very light touch approach to them. And the research evidence around these initiatives suggests that whilst they were symbolically important, they actually were largely ineffective in terms of improving community relations. And some research suggests that they actually exacerbated tensions between the two groups. Integrated education or integrated schools were a more systemic intervention. These schools are schools that seek to educate Catholics and Protestants together within an ethos of integration. They came about as a result of lobbying on the part of parents who wanted an alternative to the segregated education system for their children. There are now about 65 integrated schools in Northern Ireland, both new integrated schools and schools that have transformed from existing segregated status. Research evidence is positive, suggesting that integrated schools are effective in promoting more pro-social community attitudes amongst pupils. However, the sector remains niche, accounting for only around 7% of overall educational provision in Northern Ireland, and there's little evidence to suggest that it's likely to expand very much. Indeed, it's been a long time since a new integrated school was actually established. Alongside this, then, there were a series of curricular reforms which were designed at aimed at promoting mutual understanding, respect for diversity, and citizenship education. And research on these, indeed, one of your colleagues here, Dr. Helen Hanna, was involved in doing some of this research, suggests that whilst these reforms had the potential to create important dialogical space, this was largely unrealised, mainly because teachers were reluctant to engage in conversation, debate and dialogue around very contested and controversial issues relating to the source and cause of conflict. So against this background, and in the context of the peace process in Northern Ireland, a number of educational stakeholders came together in the mid-2000s to consider what could be done within the largely parallel system of education to harness what they saw as the potential of schools to contribute to embedding the peace. And they came up with this idea for shared education. The shared education model promotes curriculum-based collaboration between schools from different sectors, Catholic, Protestant, and integrated, as a mechanism for improving intergroup relations and enhancing educational opportunities for all children. The model is underpinned by contact theory, and it operates in a variety of different ways. So, for example, partner schools can collaborate to extend curriculum choice available to pupils. And how this would work is that in a partnership, one school, say the Catholic school, might offer some subject options that are not available in the partner Protestant school, and vice versa. And pupils from both schools who want to take a particular subject will travel to the school that offers that subject in order for their classes or lessons in that particular subject. And what this means is that for a number of pupils traveling between schools is that they get some of their education in the partner school, and they spend an extended period of time learning with pupils who are not from their community background. Other examples of shared education include joint extracurricular activities, so that pupils have the opportunity to engage in activities that are offered outside of the curriculum in the other school that might not be offered in their own school. Shared teacher development activities, so teachers from collaborating partnerships will have teacher development activities undertaken on a partnership basis as opposed to within individual school settings. And teacher exchanges. So for example, this would be where a teacher from one school with a particular area of expertise will visit another school to teach a subject that's not offered in that school. Shared education it started back in 2007 as a series of pilot partnerships. And this was followed then by larger scale interventions that were funded through some government funding and some philanthropic funding. And through this, this has led to a situation, this has led to the initiative gaining some statutory traction. So in 2014 and 2016, there was legislation passed to place shared education on a statutory footing. So there is now in Northern Ireland a statutory duty on education providers to encourage, facilitate and promote shared education. Currently, there are around 2/3 of all schools involved in shared education, and schools are routinely inspected on how they are meeting the Department of Education's objectives for shared education. Now that shared education is well established in Northern Ireland, we have been exploring, within Queen's have been exploring if there might be some impact at wider societal level in terms of social cohesion. And the remainder of this presentation then will draw on evidence to support an argument that the impact of shared education may be extending well beyond the kind of boundaries of the participant schools, teachers and pupils to have some impact at community level. In order to kind of explore this, I suppose it's important to define what's meant by social cohesion. And to do this, I want to draw on a typology that's been created by Schiefer and Vandernal in 2017, which based on a kind of a review of social cohesion literature, identifies 3 strands of cohesion: distributive, relational, and ideational. So the distributive dimension focuses on the allocation of social, cultural, and economic resources, and this dimension places greater responsibility on institutions as opposed to community groups and individuals to reduce social divisions. For example, through redistributing resources and opportunities between regions or social groups. The literature also highlights the fact that distributive social cohesion is often seen as an antecedent to other forms of social cohesion. The relational dimension then of social cohesion is typically being defined in terms of the quality and the quantity and the strengths of people's relationships within and between social groups and communities. Trust in other people and in society itself has been employed as a significant qualitative indicator of this relational dimension. And finally, then, the ideational dimension of social cohesion focuses on shared values, common goals, and a shared sense of identity within a society. According to this perspective, cohesive societies are those in which shared norms and values are clearly defined and attract widespread consensus and adherence without coercion. Historically, these values have tended to include shared history and a shared cultural and national identity. However, in increasingly diverse societies, there's also been an emphasis on the tolerance of diversity as a unifying value. So, looking first at distributive social cohesion in the context of shared education, it's relevant to note that by the mid-2000s, when the idea for shared education was first mooted in Northern Ireland, the political and social landscape had undergone some significant transformation. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement had largely brought an end to the armed conflict that had so divided the Catholic and Protestant communities. And with this came a greater normalisation of society, reflected in greater freedom of movement for people and the opening up of shared spaces, particularly within the urban centres of Belfast and Derry. Alongside this, data were beginning to show the positive impact of equality reform measures that had previously been introduced. And by 2014, it was reported that the employment gap that had existed between the Catholic and Protestant community had largely closed, and other issues relating to discrimination and disadvantage experienced disproportionately by the Catholic community had also seen some positive shifts. Importantly, shared education also has a clear distributive agenda as per its kind of threefold aims of delivering educational benefits to all learners, underpinned by a rights and equality principle, underpinned by principles of rights and equality. Moving to look at some of the evidence around distributive outcomes, by June 2019, 61% of all schools were involved in shared education. It's now about two-thirds of all schools. It's now about two-thirds of all schools, with around a quarter of the population engaged in sharing. A recent report from the Department of Education, which drew evidence from a range of surveys, research papers and ad hoc evaluations, reported or concluded that through extensive sharing of resources, including equipment, physical infrastructure, and teaching materials, that shared education is having a positive impact on educational outcomes for pupils. Chiming with these findings then, a simulation study of 4 post-primary shared education partnerships undertaken by Barua and Knox identified higher educational attainment and increased earning power as likely outcomes of the enhanced and extension benefits offered through the partnerships. In other words, enhancement as measured by increased additional resources, and extension as measured by a wider subject choice available to pupils. It's also been reported that shared education has helped to sustain high quality provision by affording opportunities for teachers to learn from one another and matching schools with expertise in different areas. One case study reported by Tony Gallagher and Gavin Duffy highlights how a Catholic school with expertise in science education helped its partner Protestant school move from an official designation of poor in respect of its science provision to outstanding within a relatively short period of 4 or 5 months. There's also some evidence to suggest that relating to the links between school and community, that shared education may afford protection to vulnerable minority groups in areas where local relations have been strained historically. In a good example of that, in one partnership in Fermanagh, which is a border county in Northern Ireland, a small Protestant school partnered with two larger Catholic schools. The small Protestant school was on the edge of viability in terms of its low enrolment. And the Protestant community was a very small community within a much wider nationalist Catholic area. By partnering with the Catholic schools, the small Protestant school became viable and avoided closure. And this is important because had that school closed, the local community is likely to have been lost from the area, as parents would have moved to areas closer to a school that would service their children. If we move then to look at relational social cohesion, a primary aim of social cohesion is the promotion of more positive social relations between those who, because of the parallel education system in Northern Ireland, may otherwise have had limited opportunity to interact. So there is a kind of there's a relationship building intention behind shared education. It's based on some variant of the contact hypothesis, which is one of the most enduring hypotheses in the social sciences. And the emphasis is building trust and mutual respect via schools collaboration. And this can be and has been measured at different levels, including individual, school and community levels. So moving to look at some of the outcomes or the findings in relation to relational outcomes. Successive surveys have shown more positive attitudes and behaviour amongst pupil and teacher participants of shared education vis-a-vis those who don't participate in shared education. These include less in-group bias, greater out-group trust, reduced intergroup anxiety, and more positive behavioural intentions towards members of the out-group, including a greater desire for future contact. We also know that these outcomes are moderated by through some statistical modelling that has been done on a number of surveys, are moderated by increased cross-group friendships and reduced intergroup anxiety. So shared education creates an opportunity for the development of friendships, and as those friendships forge and become deeper, this has a moderating impact on contact outcomes. It's also notable that the biggest change occurs for those pupils who have had no prior contact experience or prior negative or hostile experience of the other group. And this has just been reported in a paper based on examination of more than 5,000 pupils, participant and non-participant in shared education. Qualitative research also indicates relational outcomes at group and community levels, with shared education seen to offer opportunities for schools to model positive interactions and favourable relations to their catchment community, something that those in divided areas regarded as particularly important in shaping local relations. So things like joint concerts, shared fundraising events, public congratulations for partner school successes were all considered to have important symbolic value in areas where intergroup hostilities remained. In practical terms, such events and the opening up of schools in the evening to offer evening classes to parents, for example, were actually brought parents and visitors into schools that they wouldn't have been in before, and into a particular part of the local town for the first time. As you will have seen in those previous slides, we tend to demarcate territory in Northern Ireland as belonging to one community or the other, but some of these boundaries are being challenged through shared education and the work of the shared education partnerships. Another outcome that has been observed is the potential to imagine an alternative future. And this is very well exemplified by one partnership, the Ballycastle partnership, Ballycastle is a rural area. It's a rural market town on the North Antrim coast. It has a mixed population, and that population is served by separate Protestant and Catholic post-primary schools. The two schools in partnership are on opposite sides of the same road. They're in very close proximity. They have collaborated in terms of shared education for a number of years. And in fact, they're around 40% of their provision post age 14 is offered on a shared basis. A strong relationship of trust has developed between the two schools, both of which have recently been earmarked for closure or for rebuild. Working together, the schools have decided that rather than rebuild on the existing sites, that they would like to have a shared campus on a site that is between the two schools. They've worked together with an architect to come up with a plan, and that plan has included some buildings that will be used by both schools, so a shared science block and shared recreational space, shared canteen, an assembly hall that can be used by one or both schools through the use of dividers. And this could never have been imposed from the top down. However, it has emerged from the development of that trusting relationship between the two schools and the sense of threat that has kind of diminished as the partnership has established. As I am presenting now, building work has just started on this shared campus. So that's a huge development. And there are a number of similar examples. Looking finally then at ideational social cohesion, the rationale for shared education coalesces around this aspiration for a more shared and equal society. The tension, I suppose, is how inherent within this is how to balance shared values relating to good relations, whilst also recognising and respecting differences and the rights of the other. So looking at ideational outcomes, in Northern Ireland, there is absolutely no serious expectation of fostering social cohesion through a narrative of common national identity. That's obviously not going to happen. But there are indications that the widespread implementation of shared education has been a catalyst for shifting societal norms. Brua, Knox and Gallagher talk about the boundaries between schools having become more porous. The boundaries between our separate schools have become more porous as our at a systemic level, our education system has become more integrated. So intergroup interaction in education has normalised in a society where just a few years ago that would have seemed very unlikely. Other evidence points to the emergence of cross-cutting identities based on the opportunity for sustained engagement between young people and their teachers. And such identity affiliations are seen to challenge some of the monolithic Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, Nationalist, Loyalist, Republican ascriptions that have traditionally characterised intergroup relations in Northern Ireland. And in one kind of example of this, young people in one partnership in Limavady who worked together in the drama curriculum to produce a music show, asked if they could have a hoodie, a piece of clothing that would mark out their participation in shared education. So they have their uniforms, which identify them as belonging to one school or the other, but they wanted this hoodie which showed their identity, their common identity relating to their mutual enjoyment and love of drama. It's also the case, though, that reported barriers to shared education are most often articulated in respect of this ideational dimension, specifically in terms of how to deal with the whole question of community differences, real and perceived, and contested historical and political narratives. teachers and young people would say that this is an area that, remains very difficult. The teachers are happy to deliver shared education. They're happy to have pupils from the other community within their classroom, but they're much more reluctant and reticent to engage in dialogue about contested or difficult issues. So just in conclusion then, what are the takeaways from shared education? And how is it that it has seemingly had more traction and impact in terms of social cohesion than previous initiatives? And in this sense, what can it tell us about how we promote intercultural education within more divided societies? There are many reasons I think that it has been effective, or that it has been as effective as it has been. But I'd like to draw attention to just three. First of all, shared education legitimizes diversity and difference. It accepts parents' rights to send their children to schools of their choice. And this is clearly important in Northern Ireland, where there is a strong attachment to schools that are seen to manifest some form of cultural capital for divided communities. So rather than threatening this, shared education creates an alternative space within the separate school system for the nurturing of intergroup relationships. Secondly, in foregrounding educational opportunities for all children, shared education is likely to have more buy-in from parents and teachers than initiatives that are specifically or exclusively focused on reconciliation or intergroup relationship building or peace building. Such initiatives, reconciliation initiatives, when they were tried in the past, had, as we've seen, limited impact, partly because teachers were uncomfortable with the agenda and the pressure on them to deliver it, but also because shared education speaks to the desires of most parents and teachers to get the best education for their children. And finally, then, I think the timing of the intervention might be relevant. Shared education was introduced in post-agreement, post-ceasefire Northern Ireland, in a demilitarised environment where shared spaces are opening up and where engagement with the other poses less of a threat than it would have done. Alongside this, whilst some inequalities remain, the grievances of the past relating to discrimination and disadvantage of one community over the other have largely been addressed. And there is a constitutional settlement that both communities can live with, albeit that there remains in Northern Ireland a myriad of social problems relating to the legacy of conflict. But I do think that the timing of the intervention is important, and what happens within that kind of wider environmental, social, historical and political context is important. And finally, just to say, and to end on this note, I suppose, whilst much of this all seems very positive, and shared education does seem to be having some positive impact, it is important to say that there are many challenges that remain, not least of which is harnessing the potential for shared education to maximise the dialogical spaces that it has created. The research evidence, as I've said, suggests that while contact between pupils and teachers from different community backgrounds has normalised, it's embedded, engagement between them on contentious or controversial or contested issues remains much more limited. And part of that is to do with how we prepare teachers for delivering shared education. And part of it is to do with, I think, the willingness of pupils to talk about stuff that is deeply contentious. So I want to finish on that point. I look forward to your questions, and I just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to give this presentation. Thank you.
So welcome to the discussion section, and I'm Professor Hui Ming Tac from the Department of Special Education and Counseling. I'm going to chair a brief Q&A sections. Yeah. To begin with, I would like to say thank you to Professor Joanne Hughes for giving us such an insightful lecture. And the talk focused on social cohesion. It addressed the issue of differences, diversity, and inclusion, and also the fundamental element of education, something like collaboration, trust, and belongingness. We are so happy Joanne is here, join us, and I believe that will make the dialogue more dynamic and interesting. And for our panel member, and as you can see, we have Annette Edward, and he's the principal of Lee Po Chin United World College of Hong Kong. So, and other panel member, as you can see, Professor Liz Jackson is over there. And she is our colleague from the Department of International Education. And then further, we have Dr. Miron Baumik in the panel, Miron. And he's our colleague from Department of Education Policy and Leadership. And his interest in educational policy and practice with a special focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. May I firstly invite Annette, anything to comment or any question for Joanne? Joanne is here.
Thank you very much, Professor Hui Ming Tac, and thank you for that introduction as well. And I know a big thank you to Professor Joanne Hughes for a truly inspiring lecture, and gave me certainly lots and lots to think about. Maybe just to elaborate a little bit about Lee Po Chin United World College. We are one of 18 United World Colleges around the world. The original was United World College in Atlantic College in Wales, founded just after or during the Cold War. And really the thinking was to bring young people together for peace and a sustainable future. And each of our 18 schools and colleges around the world have that real focus. And perhaps for those of you who are perhaps listening to this from Hong Kong may not be aware, for example, of one of our sister colleges in Bosnia-Herzegovina that brings together students from the three ethnic groups. And I believe it's still the only school that does that in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that's really what our mission is about. And I feel in Hong Kong, we have a really important role to play in terms of bringing peace to as a concept in terms of Hong Kong, but if you like, the wider world. We're bringing, as already been said, 80 different nationalities onto campus. The fact that we have scholarships means that many of those are students that are unable normally to be able to access international education. So they're all doing the IB diploma. They're all students aged 16 to 18. So we're like a if you like, university program. And I must admit, I've been here now 10 years, and I'm extremely proud to be a small way associated with the college. So hearing your talk, as you can imagine, so much resonated with me. But perhaps my first question really was that from what I picked up from the work on shared education, it really seemed to very much focus on a bottoming up approach, is how I would describe it. So you managed to find principals, other teachers that really believed in this, and that sort of bottom up. And as a result, it's now become if you like, a standard, if you like, practice across Northern Ireland. And that seems to me also linked to very much distributed leadership. All right, that by allowing that to happen. So I guess my if you like, my first question or perhaps comment is to what extent, is in a sense, was that true? All right, was it that, and how much therefore does mission of a school, vision of a school, right, vision of the leadership have a role to play in that? Because you heard the mission of UWC, which is about peace and a sustainable future. And I'm wondering how much, therefore, the mission and vision of the leaders had a role to play in that, certainly those early stages.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it was the leadership of the school and the commitment of the school principal to the kind of values of collaboration and sharing were hugely important. And in the early days when we, or colleagues of mine, were looking for schools to participate in the pilots, those schools that ended up engaging were ones that had informally built very good relationships with partner schools prior to this programme. So in a sense, they had been doing some shared education long before it was formally named. And those schools, in a sense, have been the trailblazers. I mentioned one of them in the presentation, the Ballycastle schools. They were one of the pilots right at the outset. And those are two post-primary schools, one on either side of the road in a very divided area of Northern Ireland. They had been working together previously, and they embraced the shared education model and they now offer about 40% of their overall provision, curricular provision, on a shared basis. And they are the schools that have opted for a shared campus, so that they, both of those schools are designated for redevelopment, and collaborating together. They've decided that rather than separate schools, they want a shared campus on a common site. There'll still be separate schools within the campus, but a lot of the facilities and provision will be shared. So they were a great kind of model example for other schools, because the view was, well, if they can do it, then we might be able to do it as well. So leadership, commitment of the school leader, the school ethos has been hugely important. And we've also seen that in terms of, there are schools where this has been less successful, and sometimes that has come down to school leaders being in it for the wrong reasons. So there's funding attached to shared education, and sometimes people participate because they see it as a way of accessing funding that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to get. And that's the rationale for going into it. And what we tend to find, the research evidence seems to show that those schools tend to be less successful or less effective in respect of shared education outcomes.
Great, thank you. So the second question, or second thought, again, if I've understood right, towards the end, and what's going on now, is also being a catalyst for the shared education for change within communities, and shared some of that work. And I'm very interested in this work of the school connecting with perhaps NGOs and various other groups. So I guess my question there is about what have you seen as the critical success factors that have led to those partnerships between a school and an NGO? And I think that's interesting for a lot of school leaders in lots of different contexts, because as school is looking out to work often in all sorts of different NGOs, it's good to know what you may have seen, maybe too early for you to identify that, what the critical success factors are.
I think there are a number of school partnerships where schools are working with other agencies and organisations and NGOs. And some of those partnerships would, in the Northern Ireland context, be quite contentious. So just to give you an example, in one of the partnerships in Derry/Londonderry, we can't agree on what to call it. If you're Catholic, you tend to call it Derry, and if you're Protestant, Londonderry. One of the school partnerships there decided that they wanted to work with the police. And for the Catholic National School, that was really contentious. And they would never have worked with the police except through the partnership. So in that case, communication was hugely important. Planning was hugely important. Being clear about what the objectives were was hugely important, because the chances, there was a possibility here that this could be very disruptive in terms of community relations. One of the, that was difficult work, but it actually proved to be quite effective. And one of the reasons why it was quite effective is because of the way in which the police engaged. So they were very informal with the kids in their engagement. They came to the school not wearing uniform. They use their first names. So it's about, if you're working with these organisations, it's about adapting, being sensitive to the local circumstances and the situation and the dynamic between the community and those organisations or agencies. That's one example. Another example, when I talked about the schools having this kind of ripple effect at community level, a lot of schools have opened on an extended school basis. So they're offering classes in the evening, for example, and that kind of wraparound school approach is proving to be effective in the school working with a number of bodies, agencies, organisations who are using the school facility to offer classes for adults in the evening, for example, and that's has been quite effective there.
Right. I have to say your passion for this work is really coming through in terms of your answer. So thank you for that. And just your knowledge is fantastic. My final question is, in terms of your lecture, you talked a lot about Protestant and Catholic, but actually, from my limited understanding of, though I'm from the UK originally, not either will fall into those camps. All right, Protestant or Catholic. So how does this work with others that don't identify with those two labels? Because and any thoughts you've got on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Whilst many people now, young people in particular, will say that they don't self-identify as Catholic or Protestant, most would recognise themselves as coming from a Catholic or Protestant community background, and our schools are divided on that basis. But you're right, we do also have a small, although I think it's growing in the recent census, the census that's due out will I'm sure show this. There are other ethnic groups in Northern Ireland, and we have a fairly settled Chinese and Indian community, for example. And in a sense that it's much less contentious because people from the Chinese or Indian community, for example, will usually go to their nearest school. They'll not go to a school that is because it's Catholic or state controlled, which is the mainly Protestant school. And so they have much less concern about crossing that boundary of going into the other school. On the kind of, I suppose, more negative side, often teachers will use when they're exploring issues of citizenship or identity, they will focus on those smaller ethnic minority groups because it's easier than dealing with the elephant in the room, which is the relations between Catholic and Protestant and those political differences. And so sometimes it's used as almost like an avoidance strategy of dealing with the big contentious issues. And so there's an interesting kind of dynamic there. But I suppose in response to your question, that aspect of the work is less contentious and more straightforward in that sense, because people from other minority ethnic communities generally don't have an issue going into a school that's not the one that they enrolled in.
But I wonder whether in time, I guess some of the perspective I can bring is when we have students who have come from conflict and they join our communities, they really do add something. Because they have actually, they've come from a refugee camp, they've come from, and so what they can add to communities is quite extraordinary. And unfortunately, the situation in Northern Ireland isn't at that level now. It was. And, maybe, it gives us, young people also some reminders of what can happen in terms of conflict. So,
yes,
right.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think that it offers a kind of a global perspective that we have a tendency in Northern Ireland to be very insular in our thinking and to think that, nothing happens outside of this place. And you're right. We've had Syrian refugees join our schools, for example, in recent times. And that there are issues that are to do with language and inclusion and engagement in that sense. But in terms of our conflict, it offers a different perspective. Yeah.
I'm finished now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Yeah, so we may now move to Liz. Yeah, Liz. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mintek, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And thank you, Joanne, for your wonderful presentation. It's so nice to meet you. And I really found your presentation fascinating. I do have a background in international topics and in diversity issues, but I haven't focused on the case of Northern Ireland before. So it was really illuminating for me to understand what's going on there and some of the sort of practical and new ways of thinking about and resolving some of the tensions that have been going on for some time there. So my research has dealt with some similar issues, actually, in terms of religious difference in United States context, particularly Islamophobia. And I'm also very interested in discourse of sort of clash of civilizations and sort of West versus East. And I think religious differences are tied into those kinds of differences sometimes. So I have a few questions for you based on this sort of international angle. The first question is, I'm not an expert on context theory exactly, but I am aware of some similar projects that have been done, I think with religious minorities in England, in the case of Cyprus, and in places that have these historical conflicts. I think it's often the case that direct contact, actually meeting people who are different from you or seen as different and sort of the opposite or the enemy, that this makes just a world of difference. I think this has been seen time and again. But I'm wondering, since I'm not an expert on the case of Northern Ireland here, what do you think is unique to the Northern Ireland situation in terms of sort of the more global findings and context for contact theory? What do you think is really distinctive about that context that makes maybe the theories more difficult to apply or the practices more challenging, or where the rest of the world could learn more from the case of Northern Ireland?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're right. In terms of contact theory, there is a kind of an overwhelming body of evidence internationally for the effectiveness of contact as a means of reducing prejudice, provided that contact meets certain conditions. And those conditions include things like there is institutional support for the contact that's taking place, there is equality in the contact situation, that the contact is collaborative as opposed to competitive. I mean, these are kind of, I suppose, obvious things at some level. We have been doing shared education, not just in Northern Ireland, but the model, there's been a lot of interest internationally in the model. And so there are now shared education pilots that we've been supporting in Israel, for example. There's around 100 schools in Israel partnering Arab and Jewish schools. We've also been working in the Balkans. So you mentioned Bosnia before. We've done some work there. We don't have pilots there yet, but we've done some work there. But we have pilots in Macedonia, North Macedonia, and we are about to start some work in Kosovo. And I think it's interesting because the model, it's always dangerous to think that you can just lift a model from one context and apply it somewhere else and it will have the same outcomes. That's just not the case. I think what makes shared education effective in Northern Ireland is the level of institutional support that there is for it. And we've seen Israel, it's much harder to do this. So the level of institutional support, I think, and I talked about this in the talk, the equality agenda. I mean, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland mostly would agree now, and surveys have shown this, that there is generally equality here, that those two communities feel equal and have an equal stake in society. And I think that has been hugely important as an indicator of effectiveness. I think the nature of the engagement, which is, as I said, shared education offers educational opportunities for all children. So it's not just about a reconciliation agenda. And I think previous initiatives were less successful because they foregrounded reconciliation as opposed to this offering educational opportunities and reconciliation or intergroup relations being a part of that. If you see what I mean. So there's a rationale that offers something other than let's just focus on reconciliation, because that has not been shown to be effective in the past. So that I think those are if we look at shared education in the context of what had gone on in Northern Ireland before in terms of this type of intervention, I think that's what makes it kind of unique, is the environment, the context, the institutional support, the antecedent equality agenda. And then I think that it offers something which neither group could achieve working on its own, which are these kind of creation of these new educational opportunities.
Great. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. I think that this also sort of helps me to understand the way that we can, I mean, as you say, that we can't just take practices and take them from one place to another, but on the other hand, showing that there's some vital aspects of this that have led to this success, including the sort of approach and the ultimate goals and aims. So that's really helpful for me. I have another question, which is about the civic identity of the students. So in my work, I'm very interested in the relationship between the local sense of identity and national and international, because I think nowadays there's actually a lot of challenges that are not just about, say, national identity, but about sort of the connections between a regional and a national identity. So in Hong Kong and in China, people learn that they're part of Hong Kong, part of China, and a global community. And their attitudes about what it means to be a Hong Kong person also connects to their attitudes about being a global citizen. And that's the case here. So I'm curious, in Northern Ireland, I know there's very complex dynamics politically, of course, that underpins the challenges and the crisis there, the relationship with the UK, and now UK identity seems to be quite contested today. In terms of the Brexit decision and the European Union identity. So I'm wondering if these dynamics have any impact, or if the experience with shared education might have any implications for those other understandings of identity for students in Northern Ireland. Does it make an impact in connection to their sense of what it means to be a UK citizen or a European citizen or anything like that?
Yeah, really good questions. I mean, I think that in Northern Ireland, both groups, much like Hong Kong, you know, they would see themselves within, you know, having a local identity, a national identity, and a global identity. And certainly our citizenship curriculum encourages that. But I think that for the more marginalised, and so there's cross-cutting identity and social class issues, and for the most marginalised, the strength of their local identity is more all-consuming. And I suppose that relates to the nature of the experience that they have in the community. So often they live in what we call interface areas. These are areas where Catholic and Protestant communities interface, and they're often conflict, or they're often flashpoints, as we would call them. So low-level violence, there would be sectarianism. Children in those communities would be fearful of straying into another area. So that sense of local identity is very, very powerful and strong within those communities, whereas in the more middle-class areas, more affluent areas, pupils and young people tend to have a much more global outlook, because that's part of their experience. Not just, you know, they're more likely to travel, they're more likely to be, their parents are more likely to travel, they're more likely to experience places other than this local context. And so in that sense, there's a dynamic between identity and class. That's quite powerful in this context, and I think it really underlines in terms of how we're tackling the conflict or how we're tackling relationships. It really underlines the point that it needs to be tackled at the level of exploring issues relating to identity, but also tackling issues relating to inequality and rights and those kind of issues that inform identity politics. And so the approach to, if we look at how the Northern Ireland peace process has evolved, you could look at it along those different tracks. You know, that there was an equality agenda, there was and a multi-party talks process which looked at the kind of constitutional issues relating to identity. And there was also then a relationship building track as well. And I think all of those are important in us moving forward as a society. But to get back to your kind of veered off track a wee bit, but I think in terms of your question, yes, people have a sense of the local, the national and the global. But for those in the most marginalised communities, the local is more all-consuming.
Okay, great. And I guess that sort of also reflects some dynamics in other places I'm thinking of where there's a conflict of local identity and sort of this clash between different local groups. Local identity becomes the most important in that case. So actually, what you've just been discussing ties into the final question that I have, which is really I'm curious to hear more about where there might be resistance to shared education. So it's interesting that you mentioned that the project of reconciliation might not be as productive as a place to point to and aim for in shared education compared to other goals. So I'm wondering where there are tensions and if there is a group that is resisting shared education, and maybe that's sort of related to what you were just mentioning with different more marginalized communities, I'm not sure. And I'm wondering where you can anticipate resistance in the future. For example, if there's media that sort of discourages people from being harmonious and open-minded to each other, if there's a challenge with media or the political economy that is making this project so important, but maybe hinders its development going forward.
Really good question. There has been some resistance, interestingly, and precisely within those communities that I've just spoken about, where shared education has taken place within the more marginalised communities, it's more difficult to do it. And there has been some resistance from parents. But what the research evidence has shown, which is fascinating, is that schools have to get permission from parents to allow their children to participate in shared education activities. And there have been occasions where parents have said no. So the schools have had to find alternative arrangements for those children who have not been permitted by the parents to participate. But interestingly, the children, it has almost exclusively been the case that the children have said, I want to do this. They've seen their friends doing it. They've seen that it hasn't been threatening or that their friends have enjoyed it. And then they've said, but I want to do it. And they've gone back to the parents, and the children have then, the parents have then had to acquiesce to the children's demand that they want to do it. So that's been a really interesting finding. There has been some resistance among some teachers, because if you think of our society, which continues to be very divided, our teachers attend separate teacher training colleges. They themselves come from backgrounds where they are divided communities themselves. They bring their own baggage to the classroom. Some of them have been very fearful of the idea that or expectations that they've seen for themselves that, I signed up to be a teacher of French. I didn't sign up to deliver reconciliation for Northern Ireland. And they're concerned about doing shared education. But as the shared education has, as time has gone on, it's become much, much less contentious. So I think I said in the presentation, the norm now is for the boundaries between our schools to be very porous. So children and teachers move between schools really easily. So I grew up in Belfast and during the conflict, and I never experienced somebody from the other community in my school or during my school years. Never, and never experienced a teacher from the other community in my school, or was never in another school. And so, but now the norm for my children and other people's children in Northern Ireland is that that's just normal, that you will go to another school for some of your education, that you will go for, extracurricular classes will be taken in the other school. And it's challenging those notions of belonging, or challenging notions of boundaries. That's a boundary that belongs to them and this belongs to us. And that's an interesting dynamic that is kind of ongoing, so yeah, the other challenging area is around, we live in a society which is informed by a kind of a neoliberal agenda around education. So it privileges league tables and performativity, and the emphasis is very much on exam performance. And where that's prioritized and privileged, it's much harder to do this work, which is seen to have a kind of a social agenda. And so I think there needs to be some kind of radical rethinking that doesn't about the purpose of education. And that doesn't just apply, obviously, to Northern Ireland. It's a more global issue. And it's recognised as global issues. If you look at some of the reports recently coming out of UNESCO, there is an acknowledgement that we're doing a disservice to our children when we focus on these very narrow outcomes. But that remains a barrier, because schools here operate in a marketplace, and they need to get their numbers. And how do you get their numbers? By showing that they're good in the league tables, and the league tables are informed by exam performance. And so this stuff is second order in that sense.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so thank you, Joanne. And then now it's the time for Miron. Please, Miron.
Thank you, Professor Hoy, for giving me the floor. First of all, thank you, Professor Joanne Hughes. It was an excellent talk. I was really fascinated when I was hearing your talk. There are so many things to learn from your experience. And as I was watching your talk, actually, it reminded me one of my previous experience when I was involved in school partnership work between British schools and schools in Bangladesh, actually for several years. And in that international school partnership project, there was an element of national partnership as well. So in Bangladesh, it was also a partnership between private school, public schools, and faith schools. And before that project, actually, we never saw that kind of community cohesion, especially between public and private schools and faith schools. So I had that opportunity to witness really the power of curriculum-based school partnership project, both nationally and internationally. Okay, so I have few questions to ask you. The first question is about the viability of replicating shared education project in a place like Hong Kong, or how it can be adapted. I think in order for you to answer this question, I also need to tell you some background about the situation in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, we used to have a sort of segregated system until 2014. So when there were a number of schools, about 30 or 31, they used to be called designated schools, and they were mostly enrolling or admitting minority ethnic students, mostly from South Asian and Southeast Asian backgrounds. Of course, because of segregation effect and negative impact, and of course, the criticism from different parts of the society, the authorities started stopped calling them designated school, and the policy focus has been shifted towards allowing every schools to admit minority ethnic students. Of course, although there is no as such policy of designated school still exists here in Hong Kong, but in practice, those very schools are still admitting most of their students actually from minority ethnic background. And if you go to those schools, you will still see sort of a major concentration of minority ethnic students. And it is very much possible that there will be ethnic minority students kind of pass their whole school life without having to contact with majority Chinese students, and vice versa. Many Chinese students in mainstream Chinese school actually didn't have a chance to contact with ethnic minority students. And in this context, the question is, how do you see the viability of replicating or adapting shared education model in Hong Kong. Obviously, there is contextual difference. In Hong Kong, we don't have sort of conflicting context, and also the minority population in Hong Kong is about 8% of total population, and in terms of student population, it's about only 3% of student population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you actually need to have a background of conflict necessarily for shared education or the kind of principles of shared education to apply. It's really, I mean, I suppose the underlying message of it is better working together. And it's, so if you can find a basis in which to collaborate that is going to work for both schools in a partnership or the number of schools in a partnership, then there's potentially a value to it. So even if, again, I mean, taking examples from here, you know, and I think I may have mentioned this in the talk, one partnership was between a school where one school had expertise in science education and the other school was weak in science education. And so through the collaborative, the arrangement, the school that was stronger was able to assist the school that was weaker by sharing resources, by sharing expertise, by sharing kind of strategies for science teaching. And that elevated the science provision within the weaker school significantly, to the point where a few months later, the inspectorate awarded that school designated that school as outstanding in science. And in that same arrangement, the school that was weaker in science had strength in the area of special educational needs. And it worked collaboratively with the partner school to share that expertise, improving the special educational needs provision within the other school. So it doesn't need it. I mean, that was in the context of our conflict. The kids, the opportunity for teachers and pupils to work together. And through that, you get the value of sustained contact so that those involved through the partnership that was developed and the relationships that were developed were able to kind of reassess their sense of the other or the out group, because that was a group that they would normally, or a school that they wouldn't previously have worked with on the basis that it was an identity related to a Catholic identity or a Protestant identity. So the model itself is basically encouraging collaboration to support better educational outcomes for all pupils in the context of Northern Ireland. And I think in the context that you're talking about here, there are issues of division relating to ethnic identity that as an outcome of this process, you can start to address. It's not always straightforward, it's not always easy. And there will be, as we have seen here, kind of bumps along the way. But as you start to develop relationships of trust, you then start to be able to tackle some of those issues of division. We're a long way from, you know, being at the end of what, you know, shared, whatever that is. We still have a lot of difficulty around dealing with those more contested issues. There's still a lot of work to be done in preparing teachers for this work. But there are signs that there are very positive outcomes from it.
Thank you, Professor Joanne. I think the message I am getting across from your sharing is really trust, partnership, collaboration. That's the point we have to really start from. So my second question follows. It's really about like one of the things that you shared during your talk, that one of the key features of shared education is bottom-up approach, and you really explained very well, bringing in some example. At the same time, you also shared there is a Shared Education Act that's been enacted in Northern Ireland, and also it became sort of official part of school inspection mechanism. And it actually comes to me as an excellent sync or dynamics between bottom-up approach and policy and legislation thing. So my question is about like, what was the scenario actually before the enactment of that legal element and also becoming part of school inspection mechanism? Especially, I know like you have shared in previous sharing some of those resentment or some of those sort of like reaction from the community. So like, I mean, what was those sorts of reaction from the community before that, and how those sort of reactions were handled from the authority, and especially what were the drivers, like, you know, to enact this legal act and also making it part of school inspection mechanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I said in the talk, I mean, shared education started started with a number of educationalists coming together, and you know, we had tried a number of things in Northern Ireland. We had tried integrated education. Integrated education continues. We had tried these short-term contact initiatives, which had been relatively ineffective. And a number of people came together in the context of the peace process and thought, well, what can we do? Accepting that we have this parallel system of education, for the most part, it doesn't look like that's going to change massively. What can we do to work within it that offers best opportunity for engagement between these groups? And this idea for shared education came from that. It was supported by an international philanthropic organisation, which pumped quite a lot of money into it, which allowed for the pilots to get off the ground. And then there was a very extensive lobbying process that went on. A shared education learning forum was set up, comprising representatives from the policy community, academics, from different NGOs. And that organisation sought to share practice, to look at how shared education was evolving, and also to think about how, you know, who needed to be involved in order to make this palatable within communities or within the political kind of arena. So there was a lot of work done in that forum, and I think it was an interesting way of doing things, because it brought those different sectoral representatives with different agenda together. In terms of the drivers for shared education, policymakers saw an economic rationale for it, because the view was that if these schools are collaborating, there is, you know, there are implications for kind of duplication, in a sense, in these different communities where you're duplicating education for different communities. So there's an economic, they saw an economic rationale for it. The main point, I think, is that it legitimizes difference. It says that it's okay within a diverse and plural society for people to attend schools based on their identity. That's grand, that's okay. But what can you do within that to ensure that you create opportunities for engagement, for exploring those issues of difference? In other words, so that, you know, it's fine to have separate schools, but so that those separate schools don't perpetuate or reinforce hostility, what can you do within that system? And that's where most politicians in fact, all of the political parties in their manifestos signed up to it, because they saw it in a sense as non-threatening. It wasn't threatening what they held dear, but it was offering potential for engagement that could take our society forward. And in fairness, I think all of our politicians are agreed that that's important. So that was important. I mentioned integrated education, and the fact that we do have these integrated schools, which were set up by parents who wanted their children educated together. Not everybody was supportive of that, because they saw it as a similarist. They saw it at the time those schools were set up, particularly in the Catholic nationalist community, they saw that this was a way of the state, you know, assimilating what was then the minority community, and there was some resistance to that. So that was seen as much more threatening than shared education, which schools are a source of cultural capital and you know, are important in terms of people's sense of identity, and that's not threatened. Seemingly, the sense is not threatened through shared education.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Joanne Hughes. Yeah. So basically, it came to me really, I mean, in addition to bottom-up approach, of course, that political buy-in, policy level buy-in is also very important in order to be success, making success of this kind of project. Actually, you answered my third question at the end before I asked you. So that was about actually integrated education model. Sort of shared in your talk that yielded some positive result, but that was not expanded. And you already just said who I actually didn't expand. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, so the discussion section is coming to the end. I think our panel member has asked several important questions, and it's really nice to have response from Joanne. Yeah, in a discussion, I think there are many important issue has been raised. For example, Annette drew us to think about the cohesion within a school organization, and also the dynamic between different diverse group of people in the community, and also the importance of leadership and partnership in the promotion of cohesion and diversity. Police should expand our perspective on cohesion to wider international and global context. She raised a very interesting point about the dynamic between cohesion and division, and lead us to think further about its impact on the formulation of one's local, regional, and national identity. And Miron highlights the relevancy of the shared education to Hong Kong school, and the supporting policy on the effective implementation of the program on cohesion and inclusion, for example, curriculum, program evaluation, school monitoring. So indeed, our panel members sharing and question are really good for contextualization. Now it comes to our audience to rethink about how cohesion, diversity, inclusion makes sense to you, and also how it could be promoted in the context of education through your work and research, and how social cohesion could be recreate, reconstruct, or rebuild in school, community, and society. So once again, Joanne, thank you very much for your time and input. And thank you, Annette, Liz, Miron, here for your sharing reflection. Our panel member has done a great job. So for audience, we are looking forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you to each and every one of you for the time with us. I would like to thank Professor Joanne Hughes for her presentation, and I would also like to thank the panelists, Professor Hui Ming Tek, Mr. Arnett Edwards, Professor Liz Jackson, and Dr. Miriam Bowmick for their insightful discussion. Today, we have discussed how effectively a shared education can help to bridge the divides of societies in conflict, as well as the importance of school leadership and government in the promotion of cohesion and diversity. I hope this lecture has laid a path for us to go forward and inspire you to think about how cohesion can be promoted in our schools, communities, and society. Along with the closure of this lecture, it also marks the end of the Distinguished Visiting Professor online series, which has given us the opportunity to listen to and meet some of the most interesting and inspirational thinkers in education today. It has been a great pleasure to hear these speakers and to discuss the issues that they have raised, and to think about what these ideas mean for ourselves, schools, and communities. But now the time has come for you to wrestle with and develop these ideas and practices in real life, for you to develop these ideas in your schools, and for you to go forward and shape the future of your communities and societies. Again, thank you all for coming. Take care.